Hello and welcome to part 2 of chapter 6 of my Catholic superhero novel, Task. This is the last episode of this series. I hope you've enjoyed it so far, and I hope you'll enjoy this episode too. Let's get to it. Eventually, they decided to view the landscape Maggie had put together in the dream. Over there, that was where we got lost hiking, right? Matthew asked as they passed over a tangled forest. It was, Maggie confirmed. You were so excited about that silly team-building exercise, and I went along with it. It was fun, though, Matthew said. We started to become friends. Yes, but we could have just had tea and chatted and accomplished the same thing, Maggie argued. No, city girl. We had to go to the woods, Matthew countered. Made us rely on each other. Built trust. I much prefer our time spent over there, Maggie said. Matthew looked where she was pointing, and he smiled. It was a heap of ruins now, but it had not always been so. That was where we had our first kiss, he said. And second, Maggie said. I liked the second a lot more than the first. She flew close by Matthew's side and smiled at him. I did too, Matthew said, smiling back at Maggie. Oh, slow down, Maggie said. Matthew slowed and began to hover. Maggie floated to his side. What is it? Look down there. It's the waterfall, Maggie said. Matthew looked and saw what amounted to a miniature version of Angel Falls that emptied into a dark lagoon. Even from so high, he could see the stones in the lagoon sparkle. Seeing that place made him want to embrace Maggie, so he did. I remember that day, Matthew whispered in Maggie's ear. Maggie closed her eyes and leaned against Matthew. Our first time saying I love you to each other, she murmured. I was so happy when you said it to me. But how do you feel now? Matthew asked. Even happier, Maggie said. Their foreheads were touching, and their lips. Wow. And the lips. That's a odd way to put it when you're trying to write a romantic scene. Their foreheads were touching, and their lips were only inches apart. Matthew felt his desire for Maggie building, so he kissed her on the forehead and continued his flight, albeit at a much slower pace. Maggie quickly was beside him. They flew on in silence for a while, holding hands, looking down at the dream world beneath them. Then, Maggie squeezed Matthew's hand. Look there, she said. Matthew looked and saw a pleasant meadow with a small standing stone and a lazily flowing stream. I see. Should I recognize it? Let's go down, Maggie said, and she led him down to the meadow. When they landed, Matthew saw the place more clearly, and he remembered where they were. This is your patch of Ireland, isn't it? Matthew asked. My dream of home, Maggie said. This was the first beautiful place you made in our dream, Matthew recalled. He lay down in the grass. Maggie did too, in such a way that their heads were next to each other and their feet were pointing in opposite directions. This is where I started to repent, Maggie said. It's the most sacred place in our dream, Maggie, Matthew suggested. He looked at the standing stone and saw the cross Maggie had etched into it, with the letters JMJ and MAB etched beneath the cross. This was the place, Matthew thought. This was where he would ask Maggie. I spend a lot of time here when you're awake, Maggie said. This is where I come to pray and to rest and to remember my favorite memories. Memories of your Gran? Matthew asked. Yes, Gran and you, Maggie said. The only two people in this world who have loved me. Matthew sat up and turned to Maggie. There are more people who want to meet you, Maggie. More people who will love you. Maggie smiled. And they're all named Ward, Maggie said. Well, excepting Anne and Joachim now. It is funny my last name is Ward, Matthew said, with the null field and all. God has a sense of humor, Maggie said. She sat up and then stood. Walk with me? Of course, Matthew said. The two of them held hands and walked alongside the stream. The meadow was bright and cheerful, as if it was always morning there. We could go there someday, Matthew said. Go where? Maggie asked. Ireland, Matthew said. Oh, Matthew, I don't think I'd be welcome. They called me the greatest shame of the Emerald Isle, the blight upon the green. I don't think they'd even let me visit Gran's grave. In time they would, Matthew said. They'd see you've changed. They'd just see Task, the monster I used to be, Maggie said. The world is so much crueler than you, Matthew. It doesn't forgive. We can teach it to forgive, Matthew said. Maggie stopped walking. "That's a beautiful dream, Matthew," Maggie said. "But we already have a beautiful dream," she said, gesturing all around. "But only while I'm sleeping," Matthew said. "That's not enough for me anymore, Maggie." Maggie looked at Matthew with deep worry. "Matthew, what do you mean?" "I want to spend my waking hours with you, Maggie," Matthew said. "I want you to meet my family. I want to take you flying in the real sky." "The world will hate you, like it hates me," Maggie said. She shook her head. "If we were together outside of our dream, they'd want to kill you too." "We'll show them they're wrong," Matthew said. Maggie pulled her hand out of his and turned away from him. "No, Matthew, they won't listen. I couldn't bear what would happen to you and your family. My family is prepared. I'm prepared. I deserve what they want to do to me," Maggie said softly. "But you don't. I can't ask it of you. I don't have the right." "You're not the one doing the asking here, Maggie," Matthew said. "I am." Maggie turned back to Matthew as he knelt upon the meadow. Matthew could see she had been crying, but now her eyes were wide with shock. "Matthew," she whispered. "Margaret Ashlingburn, I want to stand by your side and face the world with you. I want to love you when I'm awake, like I do while I'm dreaming. I want to stand before the altar of God with you and promise myself to you." He took a breath. "I want to be your husband, Maggie. I'm so sorry I couldn't bring the ring with me, but I do have it. I've had it for weeks. Will you marry me?" Fresh tears flowed down Maggie's face. She opened her mouth and then covered it with her hand. "Matthew, I love you too much to say yes," she finally said. "But how can I say no to you?" Matthew stepped forward, took Maggie's hands, and knelt before her. "The world might hate me for it, but I love you, Maggie," he said. "You are a gift from God to me." "I'm a cross, Matthew," Maggie said, weeping. "I'm a cross." "Then let me embrace you for real," Matthew said. "If you are a cross, then you are my cross, Maggie. I'm not going to run from you." Maggie fell to her knees. She was still holding Matthew's hands. "I have no right to your love. I don't deserve it," she said. "Who cares about rights and what you deserve?" Matthew asked. He felt tears begin to fall from his eyes. "This is not about justice. God is giving us a gift. We don't deserve it, but it is still ours. Would you deny that?" Maggie took a deep breath and calmed herself. She looked at Matthew and sighed, then smiled, then frowned, and then laughed. "I've spent too much of my life denying God already," she said. "I won't deny him any more. Yes, Matthew, I will be your wife." "Yes," Matthew repeated. "You said yes." His eyes shone with joy. "Yes," Maggie shouted. "Yes, Matthew Ward, I love you, and I want to marry you." Maggie's voice echoed and re-echoed across the meadow and throughout the dream. The echo did not lose strength, but instead became louder and more forceful the longer it lasted. It rose to the sky like a cresting wave, and then crashed down again like a thunderbolt. "Maggie, what's happening?" Matthew asked. The dream began to melt like snow beneath the sun. Matthew could feel Maggie's hands slipping out of his. "Matthew!" Maggie shouted. "I can feel it! I'm waking!" "Maggie!" Matthew shouted as the force pulling them apart grew stronger. "Something's wrong," Maggie said. "It hurts!" "Wake me, Maggie!" Matthew shouted. Maggie's face betrayed the depth of her pain. "Matthew!" she cried. She reached out to him desperately. And then the dream ended, and Maggie was gone. And that is the end of Chapter 6. Thank you so much for watching. I really appreciate it. Please like, share, subscribe or follow, and do leave a comment. It really helps me to improve the narrative. Thank you so much. God bless you. Have a wonderful rest of your Mardi Gras and a very spiritually fruitful and solemn Lent.
Ooh, ancient province.